Close your eyes for a second and imagine the most terrifying silence you've ever heard. Not the silence of an empty room, not the silence of a sleeping city, but the silence of a universe that never once chose to speak to us. No burning bush, no sermon on a mount, no revelation, no voice from the heavens. Just nothing. And the worst part? We wouldn't even know what we were missing because we'd never had it to begin with. Welcome to the most haunting what if you've ever asked yourself. What if every holy book ever written was simply a blank page? What if the greatest moral frameworks in human history, the ones that told us not to steal, not to kill, not to destroy each other, never existed? What if Moses stood at the foot of Sinai and just turned around? What if Jesus sat by the sea and never opened his mouth? What if Muhammad never heard a single word in that cave? Civilizations rose and fell without a single prophetic voice to guide them. What would be left of us? Stay with me. Let's set the stage carefully because this isn't just a thought experiment. This is a controlled demolition of everything you've ever taken for granted about the human story. We're not talking about removing religion from a world that already has it. That would be a different, smaller story. We're talking about a world that never had it to begin with. A world where the prophetic tradition was never born, where no one ever stood in front of a crowd and said, "I have something to tell." You that came from beyond yourself. Think about what that actually means. Because most of us, even the most secular, atheist, proudly non-religious person alive today, is still living downstream from prophetic thought. The very idea that every human life has value, that came from somewhere. The instinct to help a stranger in pain, shaped by centuries of moral teaching rooted in prophetic voices. The concept that history has a direction, that tomorrow can be better than today, that suffering has meaning, all of it traces back to people who claim to hear something the rest of us couldn't. Without that, what's left? Imagine the ancient world, but emptier. Not just empty of temples and churches and mosques, but empty of the ideas those buildings were built to protect. The Mesopotamians are still farming beside their rivers, but no Gilgamesh-adjacent flood story is whispering to them about mortality and meaning. They're just farming. The Greeks still build their city-states, but without the undercurrent of Hebrew monotheism that would later reshape Western philosophy through contact with Christianity. Aristotle's ethics take a very different, colder turn. Humans as political animals only. No divine spark, no inherent dignity. And the Romans? The Romans are just really efficient conquerors with excellent roads and absolutely no moral crisis about what they're doing with them. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Without prophetic interruption, power doesn't face the same resistance. No Moses means Pharaoh's model, rule by divine right of the powerful submission as the natural state of the weak, never gets its most famous public challenge. That model just keeps running, quietly, efficiently, forever. And this isn't just ancient history we're talking about. This is the architecture of your consciousness right now. The reason you feel something when you see injustice. That feeling, that visceral, "this is wrong," was cultivated over millennia by voices that dared to say, there is a standard higher than power, there is a truth higher than the throne. Without those voices, that feeling might not exist. Or worse, it might exist raw and unformed, with nowhere to go and no language to name itself. Because here's the thing about prophets that we rarely acknowledge. They didn't just speak to kings. They spoke for the people who had no voice. They pointed at empire and said, "This is not the final word." And in doing so, they planted something in the human heart that has been growing, slowly, painfully, ever since. The stubborn, irrational, beautiful belief that things can be different, that things should be different, that the world as it is not the world as it has to be. Remove that, and you don't just remove religion, you remove revolution. You remove the very seed of human progress as we understand it. But wait, we're just getting started. Because silence doesn't just remove, it replaces. If this already has your mind spinning, good, that's exactly where we want you. Go ahead and hit subscribe right now because what comes next in this story is going to reshape how you see every civilization that ever existed and everyone that's yet to come. Don't miss a second of it. The universe, it turns out, absolutely hates a vacuum, and so does the human mind. Because here's the thing, no one talks about when they imagine a prophetically silent world. Humanity wouldn't just sit there, quietly confused. staring at the stars and shrugging. We would fill the silence. We always do. The question is, with what? Let's be honest about human nature for a moment, and let's be honest without the comfortable cushion of any prophetic tradition telling us we're fundamentally good or redeemable or made in anyone's image, because in this alternate world, we don't have that cushion. We just have us. Raw, unmediated, unchallenged us. The first thing that fills a prophetic void is mythology, but not the warm, meaning-soaked mythology we're familiar with. We're talking about mythology in its most primal, political form. Without Moses, there's no story of a God who takes the side of slaves. Without that story, the divine is almost always going to align with whoever already has the swords. Think about what that means structurally. Every civilization that builds a temple also builds a theology that says the powerful deserve to be powerful. The gods look like kings because the kings design the gods. It's Ao, a clean, elegant, terrifying loop with no interruption. In Egypt, in Babylon, in Rome, in every high civilization that never heard a prophetic challenge, God is not love. God is order. God is hierarchy. God is the thing that keeps everyone exactly where they are, and does so with a smile and a festival twice a year so people don't notice the chains too clearly. So the common person, the farmer, the laborer, the woman in the marketplace, where do they go for comfort? They go to the same myths. They internalize the same theology, and they believe, genuinely believe, that their suffering is not an injustice to be corrected, but a fate to be endured, because no one ever stood on a hill and told them otherwise. No one ever said, "You are more than what the powerful made of you." The social consequence of this is staggering, because today, even in our deeply flawed world, there exists a baseline human rights instinct that historians can trace, awkwardly, imperfectly, but traceable, to prophetic moral revolutions. The idea that you can't just own another person. The idea that a ruler is accountable to something beyond themselves. The idea that the poor are not poor because the gods hate them. These aren't natural instincts that evolved from biology alone. They were taught, they were preached, they were written down and copied and argued about and died for across thousands of years. Without that, slavery doesn't become a moral crisis. It becomes infrastructure, and no one loses. Sleep over infrastructure. But here's where it gets even more layered, and this is the part historians would find most fascinating. The absence of prophets doesn't just change ethics, it changes science. Because it was precisely the prophetic monotheistic tradition that paradoxically made modern science possible. The idea that the universe follows consistent, rational laws came largely from the theological conviction that a single rational God created an ordered world that could be understood. Take that conviction away, and you're left with a pantheon of capricious competing deities. And you don't build physics experiments to understand capricious deities. You build temples and offer blood and hope for the best. So in our silent world, no prophets means no monotheism, and no monotheism means the scientific revolution looks very different. Maybe delayed by centuries, maybe never arriving in the form we know it, which means no enlightenment as we understand it, because the Enlightenment was, in large part, a conversation with theology, not a replacement of it. No conversation partner, no enlightenment. No enlightenment. What exactly are you building the modern world on? Here's the question you should be sitting with right now. If prophetic silence removes the moral revolution and delays the scientific revolution, what exactly does civilization look like by the year 2000 in this alternate timeline? And the answer is going to surprise you in ways you did not see coming. All right, let's take a real walk through this world, this beautiful, haunting, morally unanchored world, because at this point in our alternate history, somewhere around the year 500 CE in our timeline, things in the silent world are going spectacularly, almost comically, sideways. Rome never converted. There's no Constantine having a vision before a battle and rethinking his entire empire's spiritual infrastructure, because there's no Christianity to convert to. Rome just keeps doing Rome, which means the machinery of the empire runs longer, colder, and with even fewer apologies. The Roman model, conquest, tribute, bread, circus, repeat, becomes the dominant civilizational template for essentially everyone in reach of their roads. And with no prophetic tradition offering an alternative conception of human dignity, The people at the bottom of that template have no language, no theology, no story that says this is wrong. The result? Stability. Horrifying, deeply unfair, incredibly stable stability. The kind of stability that benevolent dictators love to brag about and historians cringe while studying. Because when there's no moral challenge from below and no divine accountability from above, empires don't fall to internal reform. They fall only to external conquest, and then the conquerors build the same structure because that's all anyone knows how to build. And here's the dark comedy hiding inside all of this. Without prophetic voices, the concept of the chosen people, in any tradition, for any group, never exists. Which sounds liberating, right? No tribalism based on divine selection. No, our God is the real God. Sounds peaceful. Except, and this is the part nobody thinks about, without the concept of divine moral accountability, tribalism doesn't disappear. It just loses its only consistent challenge. Because every prophetic tradition, for all its internal contradictions, also carried this radical, uncomfortable idea. The other person is also made in the image of something sacred. The stranger has rights. The foreigner has dignity. The enemy is still a human being. Without that, the tribe is everything. Completely, permanently, violently everything. By this point in our silent world's history, the map looks like a patchwork of ultra-stable empires and their neighboring chaos zones, peoples who were never conquered and never developed strong internal moral frameworks, because those frameworks, historically, were almost always seeded by prophetic contact. The trade routes exist, the markets function, art is being made, absolutely gorgeous, technically brilliant, spiritually hollow art, structures that impress without asking any questions, statues that celebrate power without questioning its source, music that soothes without ever once making you wonder if you could be better than you are. It's beautiful in a way that makes you vaguely sad, and you can't quite explain why. Meanwhile, the intellectual tradition is fascinating in the worst possible way. Without the prophetic injection of there is a truth beyond power, philosophy skews heavily pragmatic and political. The great question is not what is good, it's what works. And what works is always answered by whoever is already in charge. Ethics becomes efficiency. Justice becomes order. The thinker who dares to say, "But is this right?" has no ancient text to back them up, no tradition of holy descent to protect them, and no audience that's been raised to believe that such a question even makes sense. They're just weird and probably dangerous, and quickly dealt with. Here's your WTF moment for this scene. In our silent world, by the equivalent of the medieval period, several major civilizations have independently and successfully developed something like an early industrial economy. Because without the prophetic interruption that repeatedly told powerful people they were accountable to something higher, the drive to extract and expand never encountered serious moral friction. They got to the machine faster and used it with fewer reservations, and the people at the bottom of those machines, the ones mining the materials, working the furnaces, building the roads, never once heard a voice tell them they were worth more than their output. Progress without conscience isn't progress. It's just speed, and the world is moving very, very fast towards something it can't name and isn't ready for. Let's get personal for a moment, because this story isn't just about empires and philosophies. It's about you. It's about what your inner life looks like in a world where no one ever told you that you were made for something more than survival. Because that's the question that lives underneath all the political history. In prophetically silent world, what happens to the human soul when it's never been given a vocabulary for itself? Start with love, and not the romantic comedy version of love, but the terrifying, structured, metaphysical concept of love as a cosmic force that demands something of you. Because that version of love, the kind that says you must love your neighbor, that you must love even your enemy, that love is patient and kind and keeps no record of wrongs, that's a prophetic product. That version of love was preached into existence. It's not the default. It's not what you get if you just leave humans alone. What you get if you just leave humans alone is affection, loyalty, tribal bonding, partnership. All of those are real, all of those are valuable, and none of them are the same thing as the audacious, empire-disrupting, socially transformative concept of love as moral obligation that prophetic traditions handed the world. So, in our silent universe, people still love their children, their partners, their clan. But love as a philosophical force, love as something owed to strangers, love as a revolutionary act, that version never gets invented. It just doesn't arise organically from survival instincts. It had to be taught. And what about grief? This one is subtle but devastating. Every prophetic tradition gave humanity a framework for grief, a story that says loss is not the final word, that the dead are somewhere, that suffering has a context larger than the moment you're in. Without that framework, grief is just biological. It's the brain struggling to process absence. There are no prayers. There are no rituals that connect the mourner to something beyond themselves. There's just pain, and eventually, because the body demands it, the end of pain. And then you get back to work, because what else is there? It sounds cold. But in our silent world, it isn't experienced as cold, because cold implies a temperature you know you're missing. These people don't know what warmth would feel like. They've never been told that warmth was available to them. Now, art. Because this is where it gets genuinely interesting and a little heartbreaking. Art absolutely exists in our prophetically silent world. We established that. And it's technically impressive, architecturally breathtaking, mathematically precise. The compositions are balanced, the proportions are perfect, the craftsmanship is extraordinary. And something is missing from every single piece. Because the art that has moved humanity most deeply throughout history, the Sistine Chapel, the Psalms, the architecture of the great mosques, the Buddhist mandalas, Bach's sacred music, the spirituals sung by enslaved people who should by all logic have had nothing left to sing about, all of it is reaching towards something. All of it is having a conversation with infinity. All of it is saying, there is more to this than what you can see. In our silent world, art is a record. In our actual world, art is a question. And that difference is everything. The silent world's artists are extraordinary craftspeople and completely sincere. They make things that are useful and beautiful and serve the empire and celebrate the powerful and document the seasons and are absolutely, scrupulously, heartbreakingly not asking why. Because no one ever told them why was a question worth asking. No one ever stood on a hillside and said, ask and it shall be given to you. Seek and you shall find. In the silent world, you don't seek what you've never been told exists. Knock and the door opens. But in our alternate reality, no one ever mentioned the door. They all just kept walking past the wall very efficiently, very productively, right to their graves, which was simple and quiet and final in a way that would make a person dizzy with vertigo if they could compare it, but they can't compare it. They have no reference. This is just what the end looks like. And honestly, from where they're standing, it makes perfect sense, which might be the saddest sentence in this entire story. Here's the thing about human beings that makes this whole alternate reality fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. We can't seem to stop reaching. Even in our most secular, most rational, most anti-mystical moments, something in the human architecture keeps trying to point upward. And the question our silent world forces us to ask is, where does that instinct go when it has nowhere to land? Because here's what the data, even in our actual world, consistently shows. Humans seek meaning the way they seek water. It's not optional. It's not cultural conditioning layered on an otherwise perfectly content animal. It's structural. People who lose their sense of purpose don't simply recalibrate and move on. They unravel. Viktor Frankl watched it happen in the most extreme conditions imaginable and concluded that meaning isn't a luxury feature, it's load-bearing infrastructure. Take it away, and the whole building falls inward. So in our silent world, where no prophet ever stood up to give the instinct a name, what happens to the instinct itself? It doesn't disappear. That would be too clean, too easy, too polite. It mutates. It finds other channels, other containers, other vocabularies that were never designed to hold what's being poured into them. Power becomes sacred. Nationality becomes divine. Leaders stop being administrators and start being gods, not because anyone formally declares it, but because that hunger for something higher than the daily grind has to go somewhere, and the nearest available object will do. This isn't a warning from prophetic tradition, by the way. This is documented, observable human behavior whenever the prophetic void becomes large enough. The silent world just has a much larger void, and nothing even close to an adequate container. The result is a specific kind of fanaticism that's somehow more unsettling than religious fanaticism, because it comes without even the occasional internal check that theology provides. Religious extremism, as ugly and destructive as it's been, always has to contend with the text, with the part of the tradition that says, "but also love." Political fanaticism in a prophetically empty world has no text. It has only the leader, the nation, the tribe, the ideology. And when those become sacred, they become absolute. And when they become absolute, there's no appeal available. You can't argue with a God who doesn't have a scripture. You can't point to the verse where it says to have mercy. There is no verse. There is no mercy. There is only devotion to the cause. And the cause is always defined by whoever already has the most power. Convenient that. But wait, here's the twist that keeps this story from being simple. Because the human hunger for meaning didn't get a prophetic channel in this world, it also didn't get the discipline that comes with that channel. Prophetic traditions, at their best, imperfect, complicated best, also carried frameworks for restraint, sacrifice, fasting, humility, accountability, the idea that even your own desires must be measured against something higher. Without those frameworks, the hunger for meaning expresses itself without breaks, without guilt, without the strange, beautiful, inconvenient concept of conscience. Because conscience, it turns out, is not installed from the factory. It's software that gets updated through exactly the kind of moral teaching that prophets specialized in. Remove the prophets, and you don't remove desire. You just remove the voice that occasionally tells desire that there are limits, that there are others, that the world doesn't end at your own skin. The silent world has brilliant, driven, meaning-hungry human beings who never developed a robust sense of internal moral accountability, which means they pour that hunger into systems, into nations, into leaders, into conquest, into consumption, with extraordinary efficiency and absolutely no mechanism for asking whether any of it is actually good. They measure everything by whether it works, and it works beautifully, right up until the moment it collapses under the weight of all the things it never bothered to care about. And here's where we stand, at the edge of scene 6, looking out at this alternate world from our strange vantage point. A civilization that built higher than it could see, moved faster than it could think, and never once stopped to listen to a voice that it had never known was supposed to speak. A world that is, by almost every technological metric, impressive, and by almost every measure of interior human life, absolutely, profoundly, quietly desperate. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was just very good at pretending to be. We've walked through the ruins of a world that never heard a single prophetic word, and now we need to stand still for a moment and let that sink in, because what this entire journey has really been about isn't religion. It's not theology. It's not even history. It's about the strange, stubborn, almost irrational insistence of human beings that there is something in this universe worth listening for, because that's what the prophets were. When you strip away all the traditions and institutions and centuries of human interpretation and misinterpretation and occasional weaponization, they were listeners. They were people who got very quiet in a very loud world and claimed to have heard something that the noise was drowning out. And then they had the audacity, the breathtaking, world-altering audacity, to tell the rest of us what they heard. Not to amuse us, not to comfort us with flattering lies, but to disrupt us, to challenge us, to hold up a mirror and say, you are capable of more than this, and also, you are more broken than you think. Both of those things at once, in the same breath, which is exactly the kind of honesty that changes people forever. The silent world never got disrupted, and that's why it never got better, because disruption, the right kind, the prophetically honest kind, is the only mechanism by which comfortable people are ever moved to do uncomfortable things for other people. It's the only force in history that's consistently managed to turn the wheel of moral progress. Remove it, and the wheel just sits there, beautiful, ornate, perfectly still. Here's the reflection that this alternate history is really asking you to sit with. You live in a world where those voices happened, where they interrupted, where they refused to stay silent, even when silence would have been much safer for them. And Moses and Jesus and Muhammad and Elijah and all the others were not safe. They were not comfortable. They were not popular. They were, almost universally, terrifying to the people who ran things, because they represented the most dangerous idea a civilization can encounter, the idea that no human power is the final word. And here's where the humor comes back in, just a little, just enough, because there's something genuinely funny about the fact that the most powerful people in human history consistently tried to silence the prophets, and the prophets are still the ones being talked about thousands of years later. Pharaoh doesn't get a major world religion. Pharaoh gets 10 plagues and a really bad week at the Red Sea. The emperor who crucified one of history's most influential teachers probably died thinking he'd solved a problem. He had, in fact, created the largest religion in the history of the world. The powerful, it turns out, are not very good at judging the long game. But here's the final thought, and this is the one that's supposed to follow you out of this video and into your actual day. The prophetic tradition didn't just change the past, it changed the category of what you're even capable of imagining about the future. The conviction that tomorrow can be genuinely different from today, that history bends toward justice if someone bends it, that's not a natural assumption. It's a learned one, and it was learned from voices that refused to accept the world as it was, as the world as it had to be. The alternate world we've been walking through for the last 20 minutes is a world that never learned that lesson. And it's not a world that's obviously broken. It's a world that's efficiently, quietly, beautifully, completely incapable of knowing what it's missing, which might be the most haunting version of tragedy there is. Not the person screaming in the dark, but the person who has been in the dark so long they've stopped noticing there was supposed to be light. In our world, this one, the complicated, often infuriating, occasionally magnificent world you actually live in, the voices spoke, and what you do with the echo of those voices is, perhaps, the most genuinely important question of your existence. Not whether you agree with every word, not whether you belong to any particular tradition, but whether you've heard, somewhere in the accumulated moral memory of the human race, the central prophetic challenge that cuts across every culture and every era and every century of argument. You were made for more than this, and the world around you deserves more than what it's getting. What are you going to do about it? If the prophets had remained silent, no one would have ever asked you that. You'd have been very comfortable, very productive, and almost certainly very alone in a crowd of billions, all of you staring at a sky that no one had ever told you to look at. They spoke. The rest is yours.